Hi, I'm Kim Tasso. In this short video, I'm going to be talking about how people react emotionally to change, and I thought it was relevant, particularly because of all the restrictions we're facing in our work and home lives right now due to the coronavirus pandemic. In my work, clients often ask me about help with managing change, and there are millions of great models and books on change management. However, I always ask them to think not from the organisational perspective of what you want to achieve in the business, but from the impact of change on individuals. And here we find that there's a big emotional element in how people respond to change, particularly when it's imposed upon them and they don't feel they have any control. So there are lots of psychological models and insights and research here, but I want to focus on one model. This model was created by a psychiatrist in the 60s called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she wrote a book about on death and dying. I think it was in 1969. And yes, it originally was about bereavement, but many of the ideas have been shown to relate to many other types of loss or change imposing on people. Anyway, so I thought I'd use some props to make it a little bit more interesting about how this model works. There were 5 main stages and a few other modifications along the way. So when people are first confronted with a really big change, the usual reaction is shock. Oh my God. They're almost stunned into silence. They can't process the information. They really can't accept what's happened. They almost freeze in their behaviours. So that initial shock is where people can't perhaps communicate. They just can't process the information. So when we go past that shock, the first thing that people usually go into is something called denial. Now this is one of my favourite mugs, and it just says nope. And it kind of sums up how people feel when they are in denial. They just don't want to accept the information. It's too huge, too big, too scary, too frightening, too enormous. And maybe that's why some people during the initial lockdown just carried on going about their normal daily lives, ignoring the government advice to stay home and stay safe. So that's two, first of all the shock, and then this kind of denial. When denial ends, the next kind of phase is depicted by this character from the Disney film Inside Out. This is anger. I know quite a few people who look like that actually. Anyway, so then there's anger, where people are raging. They can't believe it's happened. They look at the unfairness of it. They want to find someone to blame because they're so angry. I'll just say here, actually, that film is really great, Inside Out. So particularly for kids, to explain the role of different emotions and that there are no good or bad emotions. They all have real value. And in the film, it beautifully explains how the strength of emotion has an impact on how we encode our memories. And I remember studying that concept in cognitive psychology many decades ago. So this is a really great film for your kids to watch to understand emotions. So after the anger subsides, we go into another phase, which is the bargaining phase. And I've put here a kind of poker chip because it's almost a bit like gambling, even though you know the odds are against you. So with the bargaining phase, you might be saying, well, if I were to do this, can this change? If I was to give this, would I get that back? It's almost like you're negotiating with some higher power or some universal force to make some change to prevent you having to combine with, and deal with the change that's been imposed upon you. Now this is Bert, and I think some of you have met him before. He's a black dog. Well, he's a mostly black dog. He's got some white bits on him. And black dog is a way to describe the next phase, which is depression. Thank you, Bert. There was a beautiful book written, and it's good for children to explain this, by Michael Johnston, and it's called Dealing with Depression, and it uses the beautiful metaphor of a black dog to describe what it feels like to live with depression, like dragging this huge dark dog around you. And it's really beautifully illustrated and really quite touching about how depression has such an impact on people's lives. Also on depression, I just wanted to note here, a book gave great hope to me and to many other people on depression, which is this book called Lost Connections, and it explores the 9 main causes of depression. Of course, bereavement is one, loss of control, loss of meaning are some of the others. And it gives real hope on what you do to protect yourself and those around you who might be having a depressive episode. So some thoughts around depression. Then when we get past depression, we move on to another final stage, which is acceptance. And I'm not a Buddhist, but I thought that Buddha was a really good symbol of acceptance. Buddhist teachings around the 4 fundamentals of suffering is around us. We will experience it, but rather than fight against it, we have to accept it. So the idea of acceptance is also important in change. Some of the more recent updates to the model suggested that finding meaning in the new reality is also quite important of that. And that's where the main model finishes, although some models have done a modification for a final stage. My final prop here, very heavy, as you can see here, is a microscope, and this was actually my 9th birthday present from my parents, because I had aspirations to be a scientist one day. I'm going to put that down because that's a bit heavy. And experimentation is when people have gone through all those emotions and then finally find time to experiment with new ways of feeling and new ways of thinking and new ways of behaving. So nobody goes through those phases in quite that linear fashion. Some people may oscillate between some emotions. Some people might get stuck in a particular phase. So we all have a different reaction to that. So those were the main areas, shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and then experimentation. When the coronavirus first started, I wrote a blog about my emotions and how I reacted, and that, one minute I was, really happy, and then I was kind of really quite worried. One minute I was really excited, and the next minute I was really kind of in the doldrums. And lots of people contacted me and said that they could really identify those kind of roller coaster emotions that they too are experiencing. So have a look at that if you think it will be helpful to you. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for listening, and hope to speak to you soon. Thank you.